When I moved to Windmere Acres, I thought I was escaping the chaos of the city. The rolling fields, the towering trees, and the old barn on my property felt like a promise of peace. It had been my late wife's dream to own land like this, and after losing her, it felt like the right place to start over with our two kids. But what I didn't expect was the homeowner association, or more precisely, its chairwoman, Karen Whitfield, to turn my dream into a nightmare. It started innocuously enough. A bright red piece of paper pinned to my front door one crisp October morning. Parking violation, unauthorized vehicle in barn, fine, $250. At first I thought it was a mistake. My barn, my truck. I parked it there to keep it safe from the rain and to clear up space in the driveway. But Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of Windmere Acres rules, had other ideas. I knocked on her door that evening, fine notice in hand. Karen's house was immaculate, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a lifestyle magazine. She opened the door with an expression that suggested she had been expecting me. "Oh, Mr. Miller," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I assume you're here about the notice?" "That's right," I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. "There's been a mistake. The truck is in my barn, on my property. What's the problem?" Karen gave a practiced sigh. "The rules state that all vehicles must be parked in designated driveways or garages. Barns are not authorized storage spaces for motor vehicles." I blinked at her. "It's a barn. It's literally built for storage." Her smile didn't waver. "Rules are rules, Mr. Miller. If we start bending them for one person, it sets a precedent." "I'm not paying this fine," I said firmly. "This is absurd." Karen's smile hardened. "That's your choice, but there are consequences for non-compliance." I ignored the fine, confident that common sense would prevail. But a week later, I woke up to find my truck gone. My heart sank as I stared at the empty space in the barn. I ran outside thinking it might have been stolen, only to find another red notice pinned to the barn door. "Vehicle towed for violation of homeowner association rules. Contact Golden Valley Towing." Karen was behind this. I knew it. I stormed over to her house. She opened the door with the same smug smile. "Where is my truck?" I demanded. "As I said, Mr. Miller," she replied calmly, "there are consequences for non-compliance. Your truck has been towed. You can retrieve it once you pay the fine and the towing fees." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my temper. "You had no right to do this." "Actually, I do," she said, producing a folder from behind her door. She flipped it open to reveal a highlighted section of the Homeowner Association's bylaws. Clause 14.3. The association reserves the right to enforce penalties, including towing, for repeated violations. I didn't trust myself to say anything more. I turned and walked away, her voice trailing after me. "Don't forget, the fines increase if not paid within 30 days. Getting the truck back cost me $500, $250 for the fine, and another $250 in towing and storage fees." I felt humiliated, but I wasn't going to let Karen or her homeowner association intimidate me. I started reading the bylaws cover to cover, looking for a way to fight back. That's when I noticed something peculiar. Clause 14.3 wasn't in the original document. It had been added in an amendment passed 6 months earlier, just before I moved in. Karen had orchestrated this. I decided to confront her at the next homeowner association meeting, but when I arrived, I found Karen already spinning the narrative. "Mr. Miller has been repeatedly violating our community standards," she announced to the room of about 20 residents. "His refusal to follow the rules disrupts the harmony of Windmere Acres." I stood up, my pulse pounding in my ears. "That's not true. You've been targeting me since day one." Karen's eyes narrowed. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. Miller." "Then why did you amend them just before I moved in?" I shot back. A murmur rippled through the room. Karen's mask of composure slipped for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "The amendments were necessary to maintain order," she said, her tone steely. The meeting devolved into chaos. Some residents sided with me, questioning Karen's motives, while others, likely her loyal supporters, defended her actions. I left feeling more determined than ever to expose her. A few days later, I noticed construction equipment on the edge of my property. Workers from Golden Valley Construction, a company I later learned had close ties to Karen, were clearing land for a new road. The problem? They were encroaching on my land. I confronted the foreman, who shrugged and pointed me to Karen. She denied any wrongdoing, claiming the land was part of a communal easement. But I knew better. I had the property survey to prove it. That night, as I pored over the survey maps and legal documents, I realized this wasn't just about parking violations or fines. Karen and her allies were playing a bigger game, one that involved taking my land. And I wasn't going to let them win. The escalation had just begun. I thought I could handle Karen and the homeowner association, that their petty games would eventually fizzle out. But the stakes were much higher than I realized. They weren't just targeting me, they were trying to break me. The morning after I discovered the construction encroachment, I visited the county records office. It took hours of digging through dusty files and dealing with disinterested clerks, but I finally found what I needed. Clear documentation that the portion of land being bulldozed was indisputably mine. Armed with this evidence, I returned home, ready to confront Karen once and for all. When I arrived, a group of workers was already tearing into the earth. They ignored my shouts until I stepped in front of the bulldozer, forcing it to a halt. The foreman stormed over, yelling, but I shoved the documents in his face. "You're on my property, get off it now." Karen appeared moments later, impeccably dressed as always, her face set in a mask of irritation. "Mr. Miller, you're obstructing progress. This road is for the benefit of the entire community." "This isn't community land," I shot back, holding up the records. "It's mine, and unless you want a lawsuit, you'll stop this immediately." Karen's eyes flicked to the papers, her composure faltering just slightly. "Let me review these with the association's legal counsel," she said smoothly. "In the meantime, I suggest you step aside." "No," I said, planting my feet firmly on the ground. "This stops now." The tension in the air was palpable. Karen finally motioned to the foreman to halt the work, but her glare promised retaliation. The retaliation came faster than I expected. That evening, I found my water supply cut off. I called the utility company, only to be told that the homeowner association had reported a major leak and requested a temporary shutoff. I knew it was a lie. I stormed back to Karen's house. She opened the door with her usual smirk. "Mr. Miller, is there something wrong?" "You know damn well there is," I snapped. "Turn my water back on." "The association's responsibility is to ensure the safety of all residents," she said, feigning concern. "We'll restore service once we confirm there's no risk." "You're sabotaging me," I said, my voice rising. "But this ends now. If you want a war, you've got one." Karen's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Careful, Mr. Miller. Threats can have consequences." I spent the next few days without water, relying on bottled supplies and the kindness of a neighbor who hadn't yet been swayed by Karen's influence. I also noticed a drone hovering around my property. It wasn't subtle, and it was clearly meant to intimidate me. I'd had enough. Late one night, armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, I waited in the shadows of my barn. When the drone returned, its buzzing unmistakable in the quiet night, I swung hard, knocking it out of the sky. The wreckage revealed a small camera and a sticker bearing the logo of Golden Valley Construction. Karen's fingerprints were all over this. The next morning, I filed a police report. To my surprise, the officer who responded seemed hesitant to get involved. "You might want to resolve this through civil channels," he suggested. It was clear Karen's influence reached further than I thought. I decided to fight fire with fire. At the next homeowner association meeting, I brought a projector and displayed every piece of evidence I had collected. The illegal land encroachment, the fake leak report, and now the drone footage. "This is harassment," I told the room. "And I'm not the only one. Who's next?" For the first time, I saw cracks in Karen's armor. A few residents murmured their agreement, casting uncertain glances at her. But Karen wasn't done. "Mr. Miller is distorting the facts," she said, her voice sharp. "These actions were taken to protect the community, not target individuals." "Then why was a drone from your construction company spying on my property?" I demanded. The room fell silent. Karen's composure slipped for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Miller. Do you have proof it was ours?" I didn't, and she knew it. The meeting ended with no resolution, but I left feeling a small sense of victory. For the first time, Karen had been put on the defensive. That night, I found my barn's lock broken and the interior ransacked. Tools were missing, and several of my wife's keepsakes, which I had stored there, were gone. It wasn't just theft, it was a message. Karen and her allies were escalating, and they weren't going to stop until I was crushed. But they had underestimated me. They had taken my truck, my water, and now my peace of mind. But they weren't going to take my home. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready for whatever came next. The morning after discovering my barn ransacked, I stood among the wreckage, fists clenched and heart pounding. The tools I used to restore this property were gone, but what stung most was the theft of my wife's keepsakes. Karen and her homeowner association weren't just trying to intimidate me, they were trying to erase everything I held dear. I reported the break-in to the police, but their response was as lackluster as before. No witnesses, no camera footage, the officer said with a shrug. Could have been anyone. It wasn't anyone, I snapped. It was them. The officer sighed. Unless you have solid proof, there's not much we can do. Maybe install some cameras next time. Cameras. The idea stuck in my head as I drove to the hardware store that afternoon. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I'd be ready. I bought a set of motion-activated security cameras and spent the rest of the day installing them around my property. By the time the sun set, I felt a small flicker of control returning. The next incident came 2 days later. A certified letter arrived in the mail from the homeowner association demanding I pay a $1,500 fine for damaging community property. Attached was a photo of the downed drone I had swatted out of the sky. Karen's signature was at the bottom, bold and unapologetic. I slammed the letter onto the table, my blood boiling. They weren't even trying to hide their tactics anymore. I called the association's office, but the receptionist gave me the runaround, claiming Karen wasn't available. Tell her this, I growled into the phone. She's not getting a dime from me. The cameras proved their worth that very night. Around midnight, the motion alerts on my phone woke me. I checked the live feed and saw 2 figures prowling near the barn, flashlights sweeping over the doors and windows. My heart raced as I dialed the police, praying they would respond in time. When the squad car finally arrived, the prowlers had fled, but not before cutting the wires to one of my cameras. The officers took my statement and promised to lock it down on their report, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Karen, of course, denied everything when I confronted her the next morning. She stood on her perfectly manicured lawn, hands on her hips, radiating smug indifference. Why would I waste my time sneaking around your property, Mr. Miller? She said with a laugh. You're paranoid. Paranoid? I snapped. Then explain this. I shoved my phone toward her, showing the grainy footage of the figures near my barn. Karen glanced at it briefly before shrugging. Could be anyone. Maybe you should stop making enemies. Her words were a thinly veiled threat, and we both knew it. But I wasn't backing down. I doubled down on securing my property, reinforcing locks, and installing more cameras. But the stress was taking its toll. My kids noticed my tension, and I hated that Karen's vendetta was affecting them. My daughter Emma asked one evening, Dad, why do they hate us? They don't hate us, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. They're just bullies, and bullies only win if we let them. But standing firm didn't feel like enough. Karen's influence was spreading. Several neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided me. I caught them exchanging whispers as I walked by, their glances sharp and judgmental. Karen was turning the community against me, painting me as the villain. The breaking point came when I received an eviction notice. My stomach dropped as I read the letter. Karen had petitioned the homeowner association to declare me in violation of community standards due to repeated noncompliance and endangerment of communal property. The association was demanding I vacate my property within 30 days or face legal action. This wasn't just harassment anymore. They were trying to take my home. I gathered every piece of evidence I had. The illegal road construction, the drone footage, the fake fines, the prowlers. I compiled it all into a file and sent it to a lawyer. If Karen wanted a war, she was going to get one. The next homeowner association meeting was my battleground. I walked into the community center armed with a laptop and a projector. Karen was already there, chatting with her loyal followers. When she saw me, her smile didn't waver, but I caught the flicker of unease in her eyes. When it was my turn to speak, I laid everything out for the residents to see. The footage of the prowlers, the fraudulent fines, the construction encroachment. I even included the eviction notice, which drew audible gasps from some of the attendees. This isn't about rules or community standards, I said, my voice steady but firm. This is about power. Karen and her allies are using the homeowner association to bully and intimidate anyone who stands in their way. Today it's me. Tomorrow it could be you. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, a woman in the back spoke up. He's right. Karen fined us $500 for planting the wrong kind of flowers last year. Another voice joined in. She made us tear down our kids' treehouse. Said it was an eyesore. Karen's composure cracked. These measures are necessary to maintain the community's integrity, she said sharply. Don't let him manipulate you. But the tide was turning. For the first time, I saw residents questioning her authority, their loyalty wavering. Karen stormed out before the meeting ended, her mask of control slipping further with every step. I left the meeting feeling a glimmer of hope. The battle wasn't over, but the cracks in Karen's armor were growing, and I was determined to break through. For a brief moment, it felt like the tide was turning. The last homeowner association meeting had revealed cracks in Karen's authority, and I'd finally shown the community the extent of her harassment. But Karen wasn't the type to retreat. If anything, she came back stronger and angrier than ever. It started the day after the meeting. I woke up to find a large, official-looking sign staked into the edge of my property. Warning, property in violation of community standards. The sign's bold lettering screamed at anyone who passed by, and it didn't take long for neighbors to start gossiping. I tore the sign out of the ground and stormed to Karen's house. She opened the door with her trademark smirk. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," she said sweetly. "How can I help you?" I held up the sign. "What is this?" "Community enforcement," she replied, feigning innocence. "After your little presentation last night, the board decided to take immediate action to address ongoing violations." "This is defamation," I snapped. "You're trying to turn the community against me." Karen shrugged. "You've done that yourself, Mr. Miller. I'm just ensuring the rules are upheld." Her campaign of intimidation escalated quickly. Over the next week, I received letters almost daily from the homeowner association, each outlining new violations I'd allegedly committed. One day it was the color of my barn being outside approved guidelines, even though it hadn't been repainted in decades. Another day they claimed my fence was 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. The fines piled up, totaling thousands of dollars. I knew Karen was behind it all, using her position to fabricate these rules and enforce them selectively. But fighting her was like punching at shadows. Every time I tried to counter one accusation, another popped up. The final straw came when my electricity was shut off. It happened late one evening while I was helping Emma with her homework. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. I checked the breaker, but everything seemed fine. When I called the utility company, they told me the homeowner association had requested a disconnection due to unpaid community fees. I was livid. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was an attack on my family's well-being. I called Karen immediately. "Oh, Mr. Miller," she said when she picked up. "I'm so sorry to hear about your power. But you know, if you just pay your outstanding fines, we could resolve this quickly." Her tone was syrupy sweet, but I could hear the triumph in her voice. She was enjoying this. "You're playing with fire, Karen," I said through gritted teeth. "This is illegal and you know it." "Is it?" she replied. "You might want to check the bylaws again." I spent the next day poring over the homeowner association's documents. Hidden deep within the amendments, all pushed through under Karen's leadership, was a clause giving the association authority to suspend utilities for serious violations. It was a vague and overreaching rule, clearly designed to give Karen unchecked power. That night, I made a decision. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I would fight her on her own terms. I started by contacting the local news. A reporter named Sarah was eager to cover the story after hearing the basics. She came to my property the next day, camera crew in tow, and filmed me standing in front of the barn, recounting the harassment and abuse of power I'd endured. The segment aired that evening. It didn't take long for it to gain traction, especially on social media. Comments poured in, many of them outraged at Karen's tactics and calling for accountability. But Karen, predictably, doubled down. The next day, she called an emergency homeowner association meeting. The room was packed with residents, most of them eager to hear how Karen would defend herself against the growing backlash. I arrived prepared, carrying a folder of evidence and a resolve to end this once and for all. Karen opened the meeting with her usual bravado. "Mr. Miller's actions have been disruptive and harmful to our community," she declared. "He's spreading lies to discredit this association and undermine its authority." I stood up. "The only liar here is you, Karen," I said, my voice steady but firm. "You've abused your position to target me and anyone else who stands in your way, and I have the proof." I laid out everything for the room to see. The fabricated violations, the drone footage, the eviction notice, and now the utility disconnection. As I spoke, I saw some residents exchange uneasy glances. Others nodded, their expressions shifting from doubt to anger. Karen tried to interrupt, but the momentum was no longer in her favor. Residents began to speak up, recounting their own experiences with her heavy-handed tactics. One man described being fined for a fence that had stood for decades. A woman tearfully explained how she'd been forced to remove her garden after Karen deemed it unacceptable. The tide had turned. The meeting ended with a vote to suspend Karen's authority pending an independent investigation. For the first time, I felt like I'd won a battle in this war. But as I walked out of the room, Karen caught my arm. Her smile was gone, replaced by a cold, steely glare. "This isn't over, Miller," she hissed. "Not by a long shot." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I knew she wasn't bluffing. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly, and whatever she was planning next, I'd need to be ready for it. Karen's warning echoed in my mind as I prepared for what I knew would be the final confrontation. The temporary suspension of her authority was a victory, but it wasn't the end. If anything, it only fueled her determination to retaliate. I needed to stay one step ahead. The next morning, I woke up to a deafening roar. Looking out my window, I saw a bulldozer tearing into the edge of my property. A small group of workers, all wearing Golden Valley construction uniforms, was clearing land as if my protests and evidence meant nothing. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone and raced outside. "Stop!" I yelled, waving my arms. The foreman, a burly man with a clipboard, barely glanced at me. "We have authorization from the homeowner association," he said, pointing to a paper tacked to the side of a nearby truck. I snatched it and scanned it. Karen's signature was scrawled across the bottom, authorizing community improvements on land that wasn't hers to give. "This is illegal," I said, tearing the paper in half. "Get your equipment off my property now, or I'm calling the police." The foreman hesitated, but when I pulled out my phone, he reluctantly ordered the crew to stop. They left, but not before leaving a mess of churned-up earth and broken fencing behind. I immediately called my lawyer. "This has gone too far," I said, pacing in my living room. "We need an injunction to stop them from stepping foot on my property again." By that afternoon, we had filed the paperwork. The court granted a temporary restraining order against both the homeowner association and Golden Valley Construction. It was a small victory, but I knew Karen wouldn't give up so easily. That evening, I gathered the remaining residents who were willing to stand with me. We met in my barn, which had become a symbol of resistance against Karen's tyranny. Some brought stories of their own: unjust fines, harassment, even threats to their safety. Together, we formed a plan to demand a full audit of the homeowner association's finances and decisions. If Karen had been using the association as her personal tool, we'd find the proof. The next week was a whirlwind of preparation. My lawyer and I dug into public records, uncovering questionable contracts between the homeowner association and Golden Valley Construction. Meanwhile, other residents helped gather signatures for a petition demanding Karen's permanent removal. The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. Her response was swift and brutal. Late one night, my cameras captured two masked figures pouring gasoline on my barn and setting it ablaze. I woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of my daughter's screams. Rushing outside, I found the barn engulfed in flames. I called 911, but by the time the fire department arrived, it was too late. The barn was gone. The fire only strengthened my resolve. The footage from my cameras was irrefutable, and while the arsonist couldn't be identified, the act itself solidified public outrage against Karen. The community was fed up with her reign of terror. The final homeowner association meeting was unlike any before it. The room was packed, with residents standing shoulder to shoulder. Karen sat at the head of the table, her composure visibly cracking under the weight of the evidence I presented. The fraudulent contracts, the illegal fines, the harassment, all laid bare for everyone to see. When the vote came, it was unanimous. Karen was removed from her position as chairwoman, and the new leadership immediately moved to dissolve the corrupt practices she'd put in place. As I stood among the cheering residents, I felt a wave of relief. The nightmare was finally over. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal. The barn was gone, but the neighbors came together to help rebuild it, each plank and nail a testament to our collective resilience. The homeowner association was restructured under honest leadership, and the toxic shadow Karen had cast over Windmere Acres slowly lifted. As for Karen, she left town not long after her removal, her reputation in ruins. Rumors swirled about lawsuits and investigations, but I didn't care. All that mattered was that my family and I finally had peace. Standing on my porch one evening, watching the sunset over the rebuilt barn, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: hope. We had fought back against the system and won, and while the scars of the battle remained, they were a reminder of what we'd overcome. For the first time since moving to Windmere Acres, I felt like I was truly home.